Hello and welcome to the I Actually Read the Book podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Regal, and today we'll be talking about a book that I actually referred to in the previous episode, just through the course of things, not because I wanted to give a hint that this is going to be our book today. It's Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, and you might remember from the last episode that Andrew Klavan mentions it in his memoir when he talks about sort of the earliest formative readings that he made in literature were the detective novels of Raymond Chandler. And I made a mistake in the last episode. I said that the Sam Spade novels were written by Raymond Chandler. Sam Spade really only appeared in The Maltese Falcon. He appeared in some other works, some short stories, and I think there were a couple novels that were, I don't think they were written by Dashiell Hammett, but they were written, they were inspired by the Spade character. I think they did include Spade, but there was no sequel to The Maltese Falcon. And so Raymond Chandler wrote The Big Sleep. That was his most famous book, and I think he wrote Dashiell Hammett wrote The Thin Man. But so Raymond Chandler, his biggest book was The Big Sleep, and I guess the reason I got those mixed up is because Bogart starred in the movie starred in all the movies of The Big Sleep, the Maltese Falcon, of course, as the private eye, as the main private eye character. And in this novel, the character is Sam Spade, and so Sam Spade is, how would we say? The physical description that's given of Sam Spade in this book would not make you think of Humphrey Bogart, but I found myself more and more when I was reading the book that I could not picture Sam Spade as being anybody but Humphrey Bogart. Just the words that he said, the way that he says things, the sort of the hard-boiled, cynical lines that he has. It's just fantastic. It's quintessential Bogart, and that's exactly what the Maltese Falcon movie is. It is quintessential Bogart. It's Bogart at his best in the private eye role. The same with The Big Sleep. Although The Big Sleep is a much more confusing movie. I'd recommend the Maltese Falcon for people who are interested in the genre. So The Maltese Falcon was turned into that brilliant movie by starring Sam Spade. Although it was written, the movie came out in I think in the 1940s, but the book was written back in the late 20s. I believe it was published in 1930, but it had. Dashiell Hammett wrote it at the end of the 1920s, and it, of course, belongs to the perhaps oversaturated literary genre of hard-boiled detective novels. Even though we do have such great novels, we have great novels like Dashiell Hammett's Maltese Falcon and the Raymond Chandler's novels. There's a lot of less books of less quality, of lower quality in that genre that I'm sure haven't really, not many of them have stood the test of time. But fortunately, this is an excellent book. It is even though it doesn't perhaps engage on the same aesthetic, profound level as something like Richard II, any Shakespeare work, or even Andrew Klavan's memoir. It does touch on some very interesting themes in particular, about the modern conception of morality, if you could call it that, about rather modern attitudes on morality, and this is a theme that Andrew Klavan touches on slightly in the memoir, that what makes detective literature so interesting, the hard-boiled detective literature genre, is that it talks a theme that's perhaps not precisely articulated, although sometimes there are some quotes which we'll get to in this book where it almost seems like Sam Spade is directly articulating the spirit of the hard-boiled detective and how it relates to the moral atmosphere of the hard-boiled detective novels in a film noir, the movies that were based on these novels or inspired by them. And that is the idea of the solitary detective, the solitary good guy who finds himself immersed in a world full of corruption, evil, temptations everywhere, and that's where the femme fatales come from. And there is definitely a paradigmatic femme fatale in this book, Bridget O'Shaughnessy, and in the way that the modern conception, the modern way of morality, which is distinct from a sort of a simpler pre-modern version of morality, where you have a set code of ethics, or you have a set religion that dictates what you do, that puts at the top certain values that you must comport yourself, that you must conduct your behavior in accordance with those values. Instead, the modern conception of morality, and I recommend a book about this it doesn't precisely, of course, touch on the detective novels, but it's a book by Kenneth Minogue, and we might actually cover that book on the show. It's called The Servile Mind. The subtitle of the book was interesting, but it didn't really talk about the subtitle of the book was how democracy erodes the moral life, and the reason that I say it didn't really touch on that much is because he defines democracy in a very narrow, very strange way, which democracy pretty much means identity politics, which is, it's a very interesting book. We might touch on it because it does talk about this theme of that the modern conception of moral, or the modern life, the modern way of the modern forms of morality involve incorporating different how would you say, not necessarily value systems, although you could say that they're different. You incorporate different ways of thinking. You don't allow, rather, we'll put it more negatively. You do not adopt, as you do have a moral code, you do have a moral way of living, you do believe that there are some things that are right and that are not right, but it is primarily it's an individual process. You as a moral actor, you have an individually conceived practice or individually created process by which you discover the way in which you will the way in which you act morally. And in order to do that, that's not just an arbitrary solipsistic process where you just invent your own moral values. It's not like it's not even really a Nietzschean sort of conception where you create your own morality. It's more that you take a variety of sources of moral philosophy, of religion, of all sorts of different considerations, business interests, all these sorts of interests, and what Minogue calls, I believe he called them desires. He distinguishes between impulses and desires, which is to him a very important conception in or is a very important distinction in the modern world because, of course, of the prevalence of consumerist culture. And so the distinction between desires, which are well thought out, considered desires, which are well thought out, considered, and given thought and given thought as to their moral goodness or badness, and impulses, which are amoral and which often lead us to make terrible decisions. And so in this same way, the reason I bring all this up is because I believe the detective genre, more than perhaps any other branch of literature, touches on this. I would say the existentialists maybe touch on this a bit, but they tend to deny or to cast serious doubt on whether there is any sort of objective morality. But the private eye, to bring it back to the genre, the private eye lives in a world of sin and debauchery. A lot of he goes to the shadier parts of town and deals with mobsters, deals with gangsters, deals with prostitutes, deals with all sorts of ugly fellows, all sorts of ugly individuals, and criminal activity. And in that world, he fights for the good, even though he himself might engage in deception, might engage in some practices that are ethically dubious, at least according to a monolithic version of morality. Even Christian morality might, or at least how it was interpreted, say, Victorian morality, would be one of these absolute systems that, even though it can serve as inspiration, it can serve as one source from which you would draw moral conclusions that you incorporate in your overall way of acting. You would not live in accordance with, say, Victorian morality or with I wouldn't like to say biblical morality, because Sam Spade is supposed to be a religious Christian in this book, and you can tell that he does adopt a chivalric. That's another thing, that the modern detective, the hard-boiled detective, is supposed to be a knight, is supposed to be a modern day knight, a knight put into a modern context, the context of dirty, gang-infested cities of New York, Chicago, those sorts of cities where the mob is running rampant and the police are sometimes just as corrupt as the criminals, because they're in the criminals' pockets and such. And so the essence of the hard-boiled detective is this modern knight, is this desire to strive for justice, to bring criminals to justice, even when you have to, in some cases, especially in the case of Sam Spade, when you have to circumvent the legitimate authorities, the police. You have to engage in deception and play people against each other in a very manipulative game. But your overall purpose there is to bring people to justice, and another goal that might not seem quite as noble, to preserve yourself, because in order to be this sort of knight, in order to bring justice to criminals, and in order to maintain safety to maintain the safety of the city, you have to do some stuff that might not, or that you have to make sure that you're not taken out, rather. You have to make sure that the gangsters don't get to you before you get to them. And so, without further ado, let's actually dive into the Maltese Falcon. Now, because I do not want to spoil this book, because I do not want to give anything away, give too much away that would dissuade you from either watching the movie or reading the book, I recommend that you do both, as I did, that you read the book first and then watch the movie, because there are some little differences. There are some differences in the way things are said, or different characters that are slightly different in the book than there are in the movie. As I said, Humphrey Bogart, you wouldn't think, if you were just reading the novel and you had no idea it had been turned into a Bogart movie, you wouldn't imagine Humphrey Bogart as being this guy physically, because Bogart was sort of a thinner guy. He had black hair, which Sam Spade is described in the opening paragraph, which we'll get to, as a blonde devil, a blonde Satan. And so and he's described as really muscular too. And so you wouldn't think necessarily of Bogart physically, but in terms of his personality, in terms of everything else about him, he's Bogart. He could be played by no one else, except maybe a couple other stars who are in the hard-boiled detective genre. But you would think of that voice is Bogart's. You just know it. And so that's the reason. That's part of the reason why I think, and it's a fantastic book itself. So I would recommend both reading the book and then after watching the movie, so you can see those little differences and just enjoy what is a fantastic story, which is, I think, one of the greatest stories conceived in American fiction, at least in the 20th century. And so let's dive in. So it begins with this description of Sam Spade himself. Samuel Spade's jaw was long and bony, his chin a jutting V under the more flexible V of his mouth. His nostrils curved back to make another smaller V. His yellow-gray eyes were horizontal. The V motif was picked up again by thickish brows rising outward from twin creases above a hooked nose, and his pale brown hair grew down from high flat temples in a point on his forehead. He looked rather pleasantly like a blonde Satan. And so that's that line, the blonde Satan, that Spade is mischievous. Spade is, as we'll get, as you can see. I want to just give you a brief sketch of the plot, and I won't go that much into it because, again, I don't want any spoilers. And the thing about thriller novels, detective novels, is that when you're reading from beginning to finish, there are a lot of what you would consider spoiler moments along the way, where even though something doesn't reveal the final denouement, the climax, doesn't reveal what happens in the climax, that just completely blows your mind. But nevertheless, you want to experience it moment by moment. You would want to read it and get these things as they're coming up. So instead, I'll stick to a very, very rough sketch outline of the plot, so just so we can understand it. So Samuel Spade is the head of a detective agency called Spade and Archer. He has a partner named Miles Archer, and this woman comes in whose name is Miss Wonderly, or so we think. And she tells them that her sister is being stalked by this man named Floyd Thursby, whom she describes as a gambler, a gangster, a man with all sorts of bad connections. And so he wants Spade and Archer to follow her around and make sure that she's not that Floyd Thursby doesn't do anything to her, to protect her. And so Miles Archer, Spade sends Archer on the mission. And then the next night, or the night after she comes in, I believe. It's the night where it's the night after the morning where she comes and tells them everything. Archer goes out and follows her, and then he ends up dead. And then Sam Spade is called to investigate the scene, and then they find out later that Thursby is dead too. Floyd Thursby is dead, and Archer seems to have been killed with Thursby's gun. That's an important piece of evidence. And so Spade comes up the scene, and because he won't tell the police anything, because of the confidentiality that he wants to bring, that a principle of confidentiality that he employs in his practice, in his detective work, he will not reveal anything to them about Miss Wonderly. And so the police, including his friend Tom Paulhouse, who's one of the main police, who's one of the more important police officers, and then his partner who doesn't trust Spade at all, another Lieutenant Dundee. They start recurring again and again, questioning Spade about the murder and trying to get him to confess, and trying to see if they can get him to confess to it. And Spade, it's funny. It's just seeing him both in the movie and as Bogart completely completely dismantle everything they try to do, and the way that he handles the police is really funny. It's amusing to me that he thinks that he can get away from that the police are such a small force compared to him, that he can outsmart the police whenever he needs to and just keep them at bay. It's interesting. And so eventually, Bridget comes back. That's her name, Bridget O'Shaughnessy. I mentioned her earlier as the femme fatale. She eventually she asks for Sam Spade's help in a different matter and reveals that everything she said about her sister was a complete lie. That everything, as in her being followed, the sister being followed by Floyd Thursby, was a lie, and that she used to get into contact with him. I won't give anything else in that dimension because that goes off into the spoiler realm. So she instead she asks him for help because she is involved in a hunt. She was involved in the hunt for a bird, that. I don't believe she says exactly what it is that she was involved with at first to Spade, but it's eventually revealed that it's the Maltese Falcon. It's this bird. It's this jet black bird that we will get where its composition, its history, we'll get to in a second, and she is being pursued by Joel Cairo, who was cast fantastically in the movie. When I looked up the movie, I was reading the book. And I didn't know this beforehand. When I looked up that Peter Lorre was cast as Joel Cairo, this is just fantastic casting. That was probably one of the best cast roles I've ever seen in a movie. Joel Cairo is a sleazy, grease-haired Greek guy who goes around. He's a con artist. He's extremely he's a grifter. It describes in the book how he just reeks of perfume and everything. Just very, very sketchy, very nasty individual, and so he's after her, trying to see if she knows where the bird is, and I won't reveal what I was just about to say. And then also there's this fat gangster named first he's known to Spade only as G, but it turns out his name is Gutman, Casper Gutman, and he's searching for the bird too, and it's Gutman who reveals to Spade the history and the composition of the bird itself. So he goes on in this chapter. He goes, "What do you know, sir, about the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, later called the Knights of Rhodes, and other things?" And then Spade waved his cigar. "Not much, only what I remember from history in school. Crusaders or something." "Very good. Now you don't remember that Suleiman the Magnificent chased them out of Rhodes in 1523? "No." "Well, he did, sir, and they settled in Crete, and they stayed there for 7 years until 1530, when they persuaded the Emperor Charles V to give them—" Gutman held up 3 puffy fingers and counted them. "Malta, Gozo, Tripoli." "Yes?" "Yes, sir, but with these conditions. They were to pay the Emperor each year the tribute of one—" He held up a finger. "Falcon, in the acknowledgement that Malta was still under Spain, and if they ever left the island it was to revert to Spain. Understand? He was giving it to them, but not unless they used it, and they couldn't give it or sell it to anybody else." "Yes?" The fat man looked over his shoulders at the 3 closed doors, hunched his chair a few inches closer to Spade, and reduced his voice to a husky whisper. "Have you any conception of the extreme, the immeasurable wealth of the order of that time?" "If I remember," Spade said, "they were pretty well fixed." Gutman smiled indulgently. "Pretty well, sir, is putting it mildly." His whisper became lower and more purring. "They were rolling in wealth, sir. You've no idea. None of us has any idea. For years they had preyed on the Saracens, had taken nobody knows what spoils of gems, precious metals, silks, ivories, the cream of the East. That is history, sir. We all know that the holy wars to them, as to the Templars, were largely a matter of loot." And there, that interesting quote, showing the distinction between, or the contrast, but also the similarities between the past, where you had the holy wars, you had this absolute code of morality of the Catholicism, so to say, of Christianity back in the late Middle Ages when this was taking place. That the Crusaders went off, even though they seemed to be acting according to these high and noble principles, they actually were going off in pursuit of less noble, of less glorious things, or less apparently glorious things, such as gold and riches and everything. Well, now the Emperor Charles has given them Malta, and all the rent he asks is one insignificant bird per annum, just as a matter of form. What could be more natural than for these immeasurably wealthy knights to look around for some way of expressing their gratitude? Well, sir, that's exactly what they did, and they hit on the happy thought of sending Charles for the first year's tribute, not an insignificant live bird, but a glorious golden falcon, encrusted from head to foot with the finest jewels in their coffers. And remember, sir, they had fine ones, the finest out of Malaysia. Gutman stopped whispering. His sleek, dark eyes examined Sam Spade's face, which was placid. The fat man asked, "Well, sir, what do you think of that?" "I don't know." And so that is the best description, the most precise description of the Maltese Falcon's history and its appearance, and its real appearance. In when it's discovered, it is covered with a black substance that hides what it is. It looks a lot duller than that. It doesn't look like it's made of gold and that it's encrusted with jewels. And so that's all I'm going to give away. Although I'm going to read from a couple later scenes just because they contain lines that are so integral, or that contain great expressions of the sort of the integral ideas and attitudes that are expressed in the moral content, so to say, of the book. And so there's a scene, and I will not give you any context for this scene. I apologize if this doesn't seem to make any sense, but I do not want to give away this part of the book to you, what happens in this part of the book. So Spade is arguing with some people. I will not tell you with whom. And so we'll begin. I'm trying to find a place. So this person says, "Come now, gentlemen, let's keep our discussion on a friendly basis, but there certainly is," he was addressing Spade, "something in what Mr. Cairo says. You must take into consideration the—" "Like hell I must!" Spade flung his words out with a brutal sort of carelessness that gave them more weight than they could have got from dramatic emphasis or from loudness. "If you kill me, how are you going to get the bird? If I know you can't afford to kill me till you have it, how are you going to scare me into giving it to you?" Gutman cocked... Oh, there I go. You already know who they're arguing with. Gutman cocked his head to the left and considered these questions. His eyes twinkled between puckered lids. Presently he gave his genial answer. "Well, sir, there are other means of persuasion besides killing and threatening to kill." "Sure," Spade agreed, "but they're not much good unless the threat of death is behind them to hold the victim down. See what I mean? If you try anything I don't like, I won't stand for it. I'll make it a matter of your having to call it off or kill me, knowing you can't afford to kill me." "I see what you mean," Gutman chuckled. "That is an attitude, sir, that calls for the most delicate judgment on both sides. Because, as you know, sir, men are likely to forget at the heat of action where their best interest lies, and let their emotions carry them away." Spade, too, was all smiling blandness. "That's the trick from my side," he said, "to make my play strong enough that it ties you up, but yet not make you mad enough to bump me off against your better judgment." Gutman said fondly, "By gad, sir, you are a character." So that's again this sort of game theoretical way in which Spade plays everyone off. Has this specific. He goes in to this negotiation knowing that he. I guess it's not much of a shocker at this point, as much as I revealed stupidly. He has the bird. He knows where the bird is, where the Maltese Falcon is. And so he goes into this negotiation with this strong hand, knowing that, okay, I'm the only person here who knows where the Falcon is, and I'm the only one who can summon it. I'm the only one who knows where it is, and I use that as my bargaining chip. I use that so I can get whatever I want. I can demand pretty much whatever terms I want from these people. And if they threaten to torture me or kill me or whatever, I know that they can't do that because they can't kill me. I'm the only person who knows where the bird is, so that would be completely to their disadvantage. So I just thought that was such an interesting way of conveying this how would we say? I think of it in terms of that it's similar to game theory, that you come in with that you rig the game in your favor. You set up some condition where the other person doesn't have a choice but to go on your terms. So I thought that was just a fantastic passage. And then later, he's talking to Bridget O'Shaughnessy, the femme fatale of the novel, and Bridget O'Shaughnessy blinked her tears away. She took a step towards him and stood looking him in the eyes, straight and proud. "You called me a liar," she said. "Now you are lying. You're lying if you say you don't know down in your heart that in spite of anything I've done, I love you." Spade made a short, abrupt bow. His eyes were becoming bloodshot, but there was no other change in his damp and yellowish, fixedly smiling face. "Maybe I do," he said. "What of it? I should trust you. You who arranged that nice little trick for beep. I'm not going to tell you. You who beep. A man you had nothing against in cold blood, just like swatting a fly for the sake of beep. You who double-crossed beep, beep, beep. 1, 2, 3. You who've never played square with me for half an hour at a stretch since I've known you. I should trust you? No, darling, I wouldn't do it even if I could. Why should I?" Her eyes were steady under his and her hushed voice. Under his, and her hushed voice was steady when she replied, "Why should you? If you've been playing with me, if you do not love me, there is no answer to that. If you did, no answer would be needed." Blood streaked Spade's eyeballs now, and his long-held smile had become a frightful grimace. He cleared his throat huskily and said, "Making speeches is no damn good now." He put a hand over her shoulder. The hand shook and jerked. "I don't care who loves you. I don't care who loves who. I'm not going to play the sap for you." And I'm trying to skip past this revealing part. And so he keeps repeating the line, which is so it's just so Bogarty, and it's so like Spade's character, and then it just reeks of Bogart too, based on because of the roles he played. Is "I won't play the sap for you," and that's another one of these game theory, sort of the game theoretical way in which Sam Spade thinks is he's not going to give her that sort of hand over him, that sort of advantage, that leverage over him, so that she can bend him to give her whatever she wants. He's a very strategic thinker. And so I apologize if this episode was a bit how would we say it wasn't a conventionally structured, as in I couldn't give away the plot. I couldn't tell you much about the plot because I don't want to give it away. I want you to read this book or watch the movie because it's fantastic. It's a fantastic plot, and I didn't want to give away too much of it, but I wanted to touch on what I think are the most important themes and give you a brief outline, or give you a very rough sketch of the plot, of the general plot of the book, because that's what this podcast is all about. And so thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining me, rather, on this episode of I Actually Read the Book, and we'll see you next time.